My dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to your online lecture. In this video, I am going to talk about regulation of blood pressure. When we talk about blood pressure, we mainly talk about systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. These two pressures may have physiological variations during our everyday activity and emotional states. So there are mechanisms in our body that always try to regulate this blood pressure and maintain them within a normal homeostatic range. So this is how blood pressure is regulated. So before starting, I want to talk about three important centers that are located in our medulla. These are our cardiac centers. We have a cardiostimulatory center that is connected with the sympathetic nerves, a cardioinhibitory center that is connected with the parasympathetic nerve, that means the vagus nerve, and a vasomotor center that has effect on blood vessels and causes vasoconstriction. When the cardiostimulatory center is stimulated, the sympathetic nerves are stimulated and they increase heart rate, increase the force of contraction. When the cardioinhibitory center is stimulated, they decrease the heart rate, decrease the force of contraction. And vasomotor center, when stimulated, it has effect on the blood vessels. It secretes norepinephrine, which is a powerful vasoconstrictor agent that causes vasoconstriction and thus increases the total peripheral resistance. So you know blood pressure is equal to cardiac output into total peripheral resistance. So if we can affect these two factors, cardiac output and total peripheral resistance, we can regulate our blood pressure. So now let us see what is the effect of sympathetic and parasympathetic on heart. Sympathetic increases heart rate, that is called positive chronotropic. Increases force of contraction, that is called positive ionotropic. Parasympathetic decreases heart rate, that is negative chronotropic, and decreases force of contraction, negative ionotropic. So whenever our cardiac centers receive any signal, they send the feedback signals through the autonomic nervous system, that is through sympathetic and parasympathetic. If blood pressure is falling, we need to stimulate the sympathetic system. If blood pressure is higher, we need to stimulate the parasympathetic center, which will decrease the heart rate, the force of contraction, the peripheral resistance, and ultimately decrease blood pressure. So in this way, the autonomic nervous system is playing their role. Now let us go to our regulation. If you recall from the last video, we had three types of regulation. One was the short-term regulation, intermediate regulation, and long-term regulation. Today I am going to focus on the short-term regulation. There were three mechanisms. One is the baroreceptor feedback mechanism, the chemoreceptor mechanism, and the CNS Ischemic mechanism. Baroreceptors, as you already know, are the piezoreceptors. The word baro means pressure. So whenever blood pressure is increased, the vessels dilate and they stimulate the baroreceptors. Baroreceptors send their signals through the afferent fibers of vagus and glossopharyngeal. Let us look at this diagram. This is from the textbook of Guyton. You can see here that the aortic baroreceptors are connected with the vagus nerve, and the carotid baroreceptors are connected with the glossopharyngeal nerve via the Herring's nerve. So the glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerves are our baroreceptor nerves that are connected with this baroreceptor feedback mechanism. Now let's see how this works. Whenever there is an increase in the arterial pressure, the baroreceptors are stimulated. When baroreceptors are stimulated, vagus nerve transmits signals to the medulla from the aortic arch through the afferent fibers, and vagus is parasympathetic. So what vagus will do is it will stimulate the cardioinhibitory center. When cardioinhibitory center is stimulated, it will increase the parasympathetic activity. Parasympathetic will decrease heart rate, decrease force of contraction, and this will ultimately decrease our cardiac output. On the other hand, Glossopharyngeal nerve will transmit signals to the medulla from carotid sinus via Herring's nerve and their afferent fibers, and this will inhibit the vasomotor center. When vasomotor center is inhibited, what will happen? There will be vasodilatation. If vasomotor center is stimulated, there will be vasoconstriction, and when vasomotor center is inhibited, there will be vasodilatation. So when there is vasodilatation, there will be decrease in the total peripheral resistance, and when there is decrease in cardiac output and decrease in total peripheral resistance, together these two will decrease the arterial pressure back to normal. So when these baroreceptors are stimulated, carotid sinus baroreceptors are stimulated at pressures between 60 mm mercury to 180 mm mercury, and aortic baroreceptors are stimulated at arterial pressure levels about 30 mm mercury higher than the carotid baroreceptors. So in this way, when blood pressure rises, the baroreceptors stimulate the parasympathetic activity and inhibit the vasomotor center. So parasympathetic, decrease heart rate, decrease force of contraction. Vasomotor center is inhibited, that will cause vasodilatation, and together these two effects will result in decrease in the arterial pressure. So what happens when arterial pressure falls? When blood pressure falls, the carotid sinus and aortic arch are not stimulated. There is no stretching of the blood vessels, so they are not stimulated. If they are not stimulated, then no signals are going to the cardiovascular center. If no signals are going to the cardiovascular center, that will increase our sympathetic activity, increase vasoconstrictor nerve, and decrease the parasympathetic activity. When sympathetic activity is increased, there will be increase in heart rate, increase in force of contraction, that means increase in stroke volume, and decrease in parasympathetic nerve activity. So venous and arteriolar blood vessels, there will be vasoconstriction. Ultimately, there will be increase in cardiac output, increase in total peripheral resistance, and these two will increase our blood pressure towards normal. So baroreceptors, you can see, they affect in both ways. When blood pressure is increased, baroreceptors will be stimulated and they will make the blood pressure return to the normal level. When blood pressure falls, then baroreceptors are not stimulated, which will stimulate the sympathetic system and thus increase the blood pressure. That is why, as baroreceptors opposes either increase or decrease in arterial pressure, so they are called the pressure buffer system. Baroreceptor feedback mechanisms or baroreceptor reflex mechanism opposes either increase or decrease in arterial pressure. So they maintain the arterial pressure in a normal range and tries to maintain the mean arterial pressure of about 100 mm of mercury. So they are called the pressure buffer system. And the nerves in the baroreceptor system, that is the glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve, they are called the buffer nerves. So this is all about the baroreceptor feedback mechanism, which is very, very important. Next, we have a chemoreceptor mechanism. Chemoreceptors are chemosensitive cells that respond to the chemical changes in blood, such as decreased oxygen concentration called hypoxia, carbon dioxide excess, that is hypercapnia, or hydrogen ion excess, that is acidosis. So chemoreceptors are like baroreceptors, but they function in a similar way like baroreceptors, but these are chemosensitive cells and they respond to chemical changes in the blood, and they are situated in the aortic body and the carotid body. In this diagram, we can see that the chemoreceptors are situated in the aortic body and the carotid body, and the chemoreceptor in the aortic body is connected with the vagus nerve, and the chemoreceptor in the carotid body is connected with the glossopharyngeal nerve, and they function in the similar way like the baroreceptors. So our third mechanism was the Central nervous system ischemic mechanism. It operates mainly as an emergency pressure control system, and it is not activated until the arterial pressure falls very low to 15 to 20 millimeter mercury, and there is increased level of carbon dioxide and lactic acid. At this point, blood flow to the brain decreases dangerously close to lethal level, and this is also known as the last ditch stand control mechanism. So let's see how the CNS ischemic mechanism works. As we have already said that it does not work in the normal day-to-day activity, it works in an emergency situation. Whenever there is severe decrease in the blood flow to the brain, there will be cerebral ischemia. That means there will be accumulation of carbon dioxide, so increase carbon dioxide level, increase lactic acid level, and that will stimulate the vasomotor center. Very powerful stimulation. This is a very powerful stimulation, and this will cause powerful vasoconstriction that will increase the sympathetic discharge, and this increase in the sympathetic discharge will increase our heart rate, our force of contraction, increase vasoconstriction, which will increase the total peripheral resistance, and ultimately it will increase the blood pressure. So in this way, the central nervous system ischemic response is working. So this is all for today. This is all about the short mechanisms of blood pressure regulation. I hope you understood the mechanisms and enjoyed the video. I would like to advise you to note down all the written contents in your note khata for your better understanding. If you have any question, please ask me in the comment section, and thank you. Allah Hafiz.